So now we're in Chapter 10 of Virginia Held's Ethics of Care, and we're going to talk about international relations. When it comes to global relations between nations, there has been since Kant a major focus on global justice. So you can think here of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights from the United Nations in 1948, which promotes the idea that there are rights that go beyond those rights that are guaranteed by each nation's constitution, rights that belong to all human beings. That's an issue of global justice. This is a good thing, of course, but the focus on individual rights leaves out the issues of care and relationships Held wants us to notice. This is the focus especially of Kantian moral theory, that focus of rights. Nations become analogous to persons who relate to one another as equal and autonomous individuals. Held writes that international relations are mostly characterized by masculinist principles like power struggles, like the struggle between the US and Russia over Ukraine, or between Russia and Turkey that led to the shooting down of a Russian fighter jet a couple of years ago. Utilitarian moral theory mostly sees international relations in terms of these power struggles and accepts that nations are always trying to act in their own national interest, restricted only by a very general recognition of individual rights. What would it mean to include a feminist voice in the conversation about international relations? That would mean more of a focus on communication and dialogue, caring relationships, like the US caring that France was attacked, and attention to context in relations between nations. We should value caring relations between nations, not just self-interested policies. And in a way, it's a lot like the economic arena international relations is, because international relations is, to a large extent, an area of economic relations. But let's look at a few details. Our main relationship with the world is military and economic. The US defense budget is $600 billion. Foreign aid is $49 billion, 8% of the defense budget. So it's clear that our main priority is to project power in the world. So what about economic power? The US holds 25% of the world's wealth and only has a bit more than 4% of the world's population. We have to assume that the US has made wealth a very high priority. No other nation even comes close. Even China, with 21% of the world's population, holds less than 9% of global wealth. So what about care? If the US holds this much wealth, do we have a responsibility to help those who are less fortunate? One way of looking at this question is to say that we're all interconnected, so that by caring for the global community, we're also caring for ourselves, our own conditions of autonomy. Another way is we can't be obligated to do more than we're able to do. So in a moment, I'm going to ask, what are we able to do? Our primary orientation toward the rest of the world is how we can make a profit from them. International trade is based on this. We dominate other countries by power, economic power, military power, political power. Held wants us to base our relationship not on profit and power, but on care. That doesn't mean, of course, that we pay for the rest of the world's expenses, just as parents don't want to pay for a child's expenses over the child's entire lifetime. Instead, the parent pays for the child's development so the child can eventually make its own money. One way we can look at international relations is by considering how the United States relates to certain Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia. Our relationship has primarily been based on oil historically, and we have friendly relations with them despite the way that they treat women and other problems in their policies, because it has been in our best financial interests. We have, for the most part, not had caring relationships with African nations because that is not an area of strategic interest for us. We've often had exploitative relationships with Latin American countries in order to carry out US interests in the war on drugs and certain political goals. A more caring approach might be to work to improve Mexico's economy, for example. That would help solve two problems. As Mexico's economy improved, there would be more opportunities to make money, so not so many people would feel forced to join the drug trade. And it would reduce illegal immigration to the U.S. rather than by making it more attractive to stay in Mexico. By looking at our shared interests rather than just at U.S. interests, we could solve problems more effectively from the perspective of a caring relationship. That would mean to turn away from the war on drugs, from tightening immigration policies and immigration enforcement, and turning instead to caring about Mexico's economy and political stability that would indeed lead to longer-term solutions to drug problems and immigration. So let me return to the earlier issue that we cannot be obligated to help more than we can. So are we able to help with the world's problems? To what extent are we able to work to help with the world's problems? Well, let's look at world hunger for a moment. One estimate from the United Nations is that eliminating hunger in the world would cost $116 billion per year. Now that sounds like an enormous number, but the U.S. gross domestic product is $20 trillion a year. So 116 billion is a little more than 1/2 of 1% of U.S. GDP. $350 per person would eliminate world hunger. And I mean $350 per person for U.S. citizens. 96 cents a day per person, per U.S. citizen. And if you think about it, if all the rich countries contributed, that number would go down a great deal. So, yeah, I think we're able to help with the world's problems. Another way to look at it is that nearly half of the world's population lives on less than $2.50 a day. The average U.S. citizen spends $164 a day. That means that you are probably spending, many of you, are probably spending the annual income of half of the world's population every 6 days of your life. One more way of looking at it. The richest 1% of the Earth's population owns half of the world's wealth. Are you part of the richest 1% of the world population? Well, it only takes an annual income of about $75,000 a year to belong to that group, because there's vast income inequality in the world. And our economic system, as I mentioned earlier, tends to increase economic inequality over time. From the perspective of energy and the environment, the U.S. has, again, just over 4% of the world's population, but we use 17% of the world's energy supply. If we're using up that much of the world's resources, what responsibilities of care do we have for the rest of the world? To help them develop, maybe to change the economic system to reduce income inequality. We can see the importance of this in one aspect, and that's in terms of the environment. We only have one atmosphere for the whole planet. So the carbon emissions of one country affect all countries around the world. So when U.S. automakers exploit the car market in China, it means that we're contributing to worsening the atmosphere that we breathe and that we live in. So it's not in the U.S.'s own interest to dominate the car market in China. If China emits the same amount of carbon per person as the United States, they will emit 4 times as much carbon overall as the U.S. And consider if we do the same thing in India. We sell them as many cars as we drive. We develop their economies as much as ours toward industrialization and commercialization and consumption, most of all, that would have a devastating impact on the world climate. And that's exactly where an exclusive focus on profit, an exclusive focus on economic value will take us. But if nations have caring relationships toward one another, we can solve environmental problems together, and everyone benefits. The upshot for Held here is that, again, on the international scene, as in all the other cases she's talked about, wealthier countries have an obligation to care for poorer countries, to help alleviate world hunger, disease, etc., because we recognize that the rich world's relationship to the developing world is an unequal one, where care is called for, as it is in the relationship, for example, between parents and children. There is, in a sense, a dependency relationship there. So care comes into play more than justice does.